art for art's sake is a very recent notion. No one thought, in the 17th century, nobody thought about art for art's sake. Art was always for some purpose, and religious art was for a higher purpose. The purpose of religious art, and there are, theoretical writers who would make statements about this. These paintings were intended, these architecture was intended to raise the minds of the faithful to the contemplation of God. That's what they were made for. You could say that's a form of propaganda. Well, sure enough. But that's what those works were intended to do. Are they still able to do that today? That's a very interesting question, isn't it?
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. I'm Gabriele Finaldi, your host, and I'm very honoured to be speaking today to Gabriele Finaldi, the director of the National Gallery, art historian, and last but not least, also my older brother. So welcome.
It's great to be here, Piero. Can I call you Piero, which is what I normally call you?
Yeah, that's fine, absolutely. Well, so, we'll be speaking about lots of things that I suspect we've spoken about many times over Sunday lunch at my parents' house. But if you could kind of introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners and to the viewers, tell us a little bit about your faith background, first of all, and then we'll sort of talk a bit about your background in history of art as well.
So I imagine it's rather similar to yours, Piero. But born into a Catholic family. Our father is Italian. I'd say of initially a kind of traditional Catholic faith. My mother is Polish and English, also brought up in the faith. And I think together they rediscovered the faith in a much deeper way once they'd had several children already. I was the first of their children. And it was, we were brought up in a Catholic environment. We went to church at the Italian church, which is not very far from where we are here, the Scalabrini Fathers. They were in a missionary order who took care of Italian immigrant communities, and that's in Brixton. So we grew up there with all the typical elements of a Catholic parish, with church going, catechism, dances, New Year's Eve celebrations, and occasional trips to Aylesford, and the Italians would gather together for big events which had some element of the faith thrown in as well. Usually quite a lot of eating as well.
Lots of music as well, I remember.
Lots of music, that's right. So it was a lot of fun growing up in that environment, and made a lot of friends, and to be able to kind of live the faith in that sort of community environment, which had a kind of distinctive, Italian character to it as well. That was very good. Of course, at a certain point, you need to take on the faith yourself, and I was very fortunate to be able to begin a sort of way of experiencing the faith in the parish with a community of brothers and sisters, which I'm still involved with today after many, many years. And that's been an opportunity to deepen knowledge of the faith, to practice the faith, to bring up the children in the faith. And really the faith sits at the base of the way I think about things, and the way we live out our life.
So tell me a bit about how you got interested in history of art. When did that when was that spark kind of begun?
Well, there's a very, very specific moment, actually, and that's I started A-levels in a new school, Dulwich College. I'd previously been at school with the De La Salle brothers in Blackheath, and then I began sixth form in Dulwich College, and there was the opportunity to do a fourth A-level in the history of art. I knew nothing about the history of art. I suppose our family background is more literature and music than art. Anyway, I took the opportunity. The first class was actually in the Dulwich Picture Gallery in front of Rembrandt's Girl at a Window. And I thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. My first essay was on that picture, and I had no idea what kind of jobs or careers there might be in the history of art. But I've been very fortunate to be able to work in that field ever since pretty much I started working after my degree. So, I was teaching. I was teaching at school, then I was teaching at university. Then I began working as a curator at the National Gallery in 1992. And really, that was the beginning of my museum career.
So you worked at the National Gallery as first you did your doctorate on a Spanish painter who also worked in Naples, Giuseppe de Ribera, who's a wonderful painter, especially of I'll always remember his St. Francis. Basically, it's like maybe his most famous piece, but. You've curated many exhibitions over the years, many that have really kind of changed the way people look at different types of art. One I remember particularly was the Spanish still life. But if we kind of take you back about 25 years now, I don't know if you remember that time, the time just before the year 2000, where everyone was worried about the Millennium bug, whether we were going to be thrown back into the Dark Ages. But there was also a time of excitement. Tony Blair was in his prime, and there were lots of projects that took place in London around that time. We had a Millennium Dome, a Millennium Bridge, a Millennium Wheel. But in one corner of Trafalgar Square, somebody remembered what the Millennium was all about, and there was this incredible exhibition called Seeing Salvation. So, tell us a bit about how that was, where the idea came from, and the whole kind of buzz around that.
Yeah, very happy to talk about that. It was a very significant event for me personally, but I think as a cultural event, it was significant too. But even before we did the Seeing Salvation exhibition at the National Gallery in 2000, in a corner of Trafalgar Square, there was the Fourth Plinth. And the Fourth Plinth was just beginning its life as a place for public sculpture, for new commissions, often the object of debate, sometimes of ridicule. But in 1999, a very interesting artist called Mark Wallinger did the first work for the Fourth Plinth. And that was a figure of a man who was made in marble, life-size. And you can imagine on that giant plinth, it was quite small. He stood at the front of the plinth, and he had a tiny gold crown of thorns around his head. He called it Ecce Homo, and people were very struck, I think, by this image. First of all, it was an image of extraordinary humility set among all those grand generals and admirals. And of course, it was a direct reference to the forthcoming millennium. Why were we marking the millennium? Well, it was because it was 2,000 years since the birth of Christ. So Mark Wallinger had wanted to draw attention to this event and to the person of Christ, representing him as a very humble sort of everyman. Anyway, that sort of led us in a way to the Millennium exhibition, which we called Seeing Salvation. The words are based, of course, on the words of the Nunc Dimittis, where the words say, "Now let thy servant go in peace, for my eyes have seen the salvation," which has been promised. And that idea of seeing salvation and giving visual form to the history of salvation sort of sits at the basis of Christian art, of course, but also it became a very, very interesting way on the Millennium celebrations to look at the National Gallery's collection. The National Gallery's collection is largely Christian. It's Christian subject matter. Many of the pictures in the collection represent Jesus or the Virgin Mary or the saints, and it made a lot of sense to focus on that subject matter, not just as cultural subject matter, not just as historical subject matter, but where it fits into the life of faith historically, but also faith today.
I mean, and the image of Christ, which was at the centre of that exhibition, I mean, I remember there were lots of very interesting kind of takes on that. But at the centre of it, there was this kind of mystery, in a sense, that we know very little of what Jesus kind of looks like. There's no physical descriptions of him, and yet he's kind of dominated certainly the Western kind of artistic imagination. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and of course there are no images of Christ from very, very early on. They're essentially metaphorical images. So artists took up those those metaphorical images, mostly from the Gospel of St. John, the great I ams, and that's how Christ was alluded to, not strictly speaking represented. It's only later, really, with the conversion of the empire to Christianity, that you start beginning to see a very rich imagery of Christ, where he looks like a teacher, or he looks like an emperor, and you start beginning to see some very, very intensive cycles of representation of the life of Christ. You also begin to see that established image of Christ with the perfectly symmetrical features, with the beard, with the centre parting. There were several sort of invented descriptions of the physical appearance of Christ, which seem to sit behind the traditional representation. But anyway, in a sense, we all know what Jesus looked like. There's a sort of established iconography, and he's easily recognised.
I mean, since then, in fact, very recently we had the exhibition on St. Francis, the Alter Christus. Interestingly, we've kind of come, in those 25 years, come full circle to another representation of Christ. I mean, I'm interested to know a bit how the media and the kind of cultural world in general, which isn't normally super friendly to kind of Christian Catholic ideas, how they reacted first to the Seeing Salvation exhibition and to St. Francis, and whether you've seen a difference over the 2 decades in between.
So that's a good question, Pierre. I mean, I think that the Seeing Salvation kind of opened a new path for cultural exhibitions in large museums, and we've seen several, not just in the National Gallery. That's been a very interesting phenomenon. It sort of became legitimate to explore the imagery of faith, not just from a purely historical standpoint, but also from the point of view of practice, of culture. What is the significance of images and religious objects within the context of a believing community? So I think Seeing Salvation sort of opened up a path for us. And certainly at the gallery, we've continued with that. I mean, we did an exhibition some years ago on Spanish religious sculpture, for example, where there was
Sacred Made Real.
It was called the Sacred Made Real, and it brought together both paintings and sculptures, mostly from the 16th and 17th centuries. Sculptures which often had a role in religious ceremony, in processions and so on. And there was no attempt to kind of soft pedal, let's say, the religious aspect. It was an art historical exhibition, of course, but it was very much about how these objects were used, how they fitted into a sort of believing community context. You mentioned the St. Francis exhibition. Well, Francis is an enormously important figure culturally, of great significance in his time, and of course of great significance today. And Pope Francis has drawn attention to that on many occasions. So the opportunity to do an exhibition on St. Francis gave us the opportunity to talk about Francis historically, to relate the story of the image we're making around St. Francis, but also to draw attention to those themes in St. Francis' life and teachings, let's say, which are relevant for today. So it seemed to me that it all came together. It was an exhibition that started with, a document dating from the 13th century and made its way up to right now with, Richard Long, for example, doing a wall painting of his own in response to the idea of Francis and his experience of being in Assisi.
And what I thought was extraordinary about that exhibition was that you also had a habit that St. Francis had worn, and the horn that was given to him by the Sultan. So you had these kind of contemporary artifacts that had also taken on a completely different. They were relics, basically.
Yes, relics in an exhibition. It's a very curious thing because we're used to as a museum requesting paintings from other museums and so. But when you approach a religious order, for example, and ask them to lend a relic, that's a little bit more complicated. And I have to say, we had to work very, very hard with the Franciscans in Florence to lend us a fragment of one of the surviving habits of St. Francis. Naturally, they're a little bit distrustful of lending a precious object, precious religious object, to an exhibition in a secular venue. But it proved to work out very well in the sense that, first of all, it's brought you back to the kind of historical reality of the saint. Secondly, it was a rather beautiful object in its own right. Thirdly, because of its sacred character, you were able to allude to the sacred nature of the life of St. Francis. And many devout people came to see the exhibition. You had many groups of pilgrims. I remember on one occasion there was a group of pilgrims from Aberdeen, I think. They came with their Franciscan friars, and they were gathered around the habit, and some of them were kneeling and they were praying quietly. And my co-curator, Joost Justra, sort of went over to them and said, where are you from? And I think they said, we're from, the parish of the Immaculate Conception. And he said, sort of, who's your leader? And I imagine he was wanting to say, keep it quiet, don't disturb other visitors. And the lady looked at him and said, our leader? She is. So there was this sense of, believers feeling comfortable in the exhibition, that there was something for them. But I think it appealed to everyone. I was very struck by Jonathan Jones's review in The Guardian, which you'd have thought is a newspaper that's not
always super friendly to the church.
Particularly friendly. But in fact, he was very personally struck, and he described a sort of what he described as a kind of conversion experience inside the exhibition, where you go in with a certain attitude and you come out with another attitude. And I think that was the experience of a lot of people. That's the side of an exhibition that really works, when people come in with a certain attitude or certain expectations, and they emerge from that exhibition with a quite different view.
And I think these exhibitions have been amongst the most popular. So it's not that religious art, has lost any of its power.
Not at all. I mean, Seeing Salvation back in the year 2000 is still the most visited exhibition ever at the National Gallery. It had over 400,000 visitors, and St. Francis, which had a very short run actually, had 220,000 visitors. They were both free exhibitions, and in a way that was kind of important in itself, that it should be there for everyone to be able to enjoy and visit, and no barrier should be placed in their way.
So, I mean, I suppose that especially what you were saying about the reviewer from the Guardian. I mean, Pope Benedict in particular spoke about this. I mean, John Paul II also wrote his famous kind of letter to artists. And Bishop Barron in particular has been speaking about this in great detail on YouTube, about how beauty is one of the first ways that we can kind of encounter God. And presumably, I mean, that was really what the church kind of caught immediately, and started producing these beautiful images. I mean, how do you, from the point of view of a kind of art historian, is that kind of recognised, the sort of the power of the images to basically cause faith to be born in people?
It's probably not recognised enough, and I think that the church has usually been kind of way ahead of the rest of society in recognising that there are lots of ways in which you can draw people to experience the goodness of God and have an encounter with Christ, and that beauty is one of the ways to do that. It has an ability to speak directly to the heart. It, in some ways, sort of passes over the filters of the intellect. Although, of course, art is also able to appeal very directly to the intellect. And of course, the church always had a great interest in catechesis, in explaining the faith, particularly to people who are not especially educated or couldn't read, and so this idea of art as the language, or the Bible of the poor, let's say, was always at the forefront of the Catholic Church in its missionary efforts and in its teaching efforts. And the church was also able to draw on the talents of extraordinary artists across the ages, who placed their talents at the service of the faith and made images that have really, I suppose, over time created for us the way we think of the faith, the way we think of the saints, the way we think of the great stories from the Gospel and the Bible. So images have a tremendous power. In some ways, they have a more direct power than the word, as direct as music, although music is more abstract. Painting usually has subject matter, so it gives rise to a sort of certain understanding of what's being shown. And that continues up to today, although the whole question of liturgical art today, and the issue of how you use a sort of contemporary art idiom to speak to the faith is a very complex one.
We'll come back to that, definitely. No, I mean, one of the questions that I had is, I mean, you say that the church has always used art to speak to people maybe who were illiterate or who didn't have immediate access to texts. But I wonder, now that we have a population which is, the vast majority are very literate, but maybe the art itself has become a little bit more of a closed book, because the religious art that we encounter in places like the National Gallery, I think a lot of people who are coming just don't know really what they're looking at. And I think that situation has got kind of rapidly worse. I mean, is that something that you found, and is that something that you try to make allowance for?
It's a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, on the one hand, people don't know the stories anymore. I think that's true. They don't know what the sources, as we call them. They don't know the biblical stories. I was reading an essay by the Italian writer Italo Calvino a while ago, and he was saying that he told this story about how the French commissars just after the revolution sent out some researchers, we call them today, to talk to French people across the whole country to establish the different dialects and different patois and so on. And the instruction they had was to ask people to recount the story of the prodigal son, because they knew that everybody knew the story of the prodigal son. So they transcribed all these various versions of the prodigal son told in different dialects and so on, and gathered it all together. I think we find it difficult now to find a biblical story that everyone was familiar with, possibly the Christmas story, Noah's Ark, yeah. But certainly the level of knowledge has dropped back very seriously. And not only that, but I think the ability to read the images has likewise largely been lost. And that's not only among people who don't know about the faith, because I've been quite surprised, I have to say, taking seminarians or priests around the gallery, and showing them a picture of the Supper at Emmaus, for example, and seeing them struggle to recognize what the subject of the picture is. So that's not because they don't know the story. They know the story perfectly well. It's just they find it difficult to make the connection between the narrative, which they know from a written text, and the image. So the ability to kind of read images, I think, has also been, in spite of the fact that we always say, we're a very visual culture now and we're surrounded by images and we think that we're very competent in reading images. Well, that's not necessarily the case.
And what do you think? That's just because they were produced in a different era, or is that just because we've got used to these kind of very particular way? The way that we see the images on social media, colourful, pop. Everything's moving. And
I think we've sort of slightly lost an ability to kind of read the images. We just absorb them. We presume we know, or we use them for what we think they're useful for. We don't necessarily kind of sit and reflect and try and interpret the visual images that we see.
All right, so that's the softball questions out of the way. A few more kind of difficult ones. So, as a sort of kind of is it a museologist, I don't know whether you would consider yourself that. There's lots of talk in the air. I mean, it kind of comes around all the time. I mean, my background's in archaeology, so the question of whether the Parthenon marbles, Elgin marbles, should be in England or should be in Greece, and there's lots of questions. The Benin sculptures going back to where they were made. There's lots of talk about artworks going back to their original countries. Now, the collection in the National Gallery, presumably, I imagine the majority of it is from Italy. Would that be about right?
Probably, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if Italy ever kind of makes requests for things to be returned, but more than these artworks going back to their original countries, I mean, what about artworks going to their original context? Because I think especially when you walk in, you go to the Sainsbury wing, and you see all those wonderful kind of those sort of early Italian paintings. The vast majority of them, I would say, are essentially altarpieces. No, they were made to be in a church. They were made to be on an altar. They were made to be part of the mass, essentially. So, how do you feel about that? And I mean, how does that discourse kind of take place in museums? And with regard to the church, because I don't know if the church really ever sort of brings this kind of thing up. But
goodness, that's a very, very interesting one. And you'll remember that when the Sainsbury wing was built in 1991, so that's the bit of the National Gallery where the early pictures are hosted, so medieval and Renaissance pictures, a lot of them altarpieces, and most of them religious pictures. So the architect was tasked with creating an environment that alluded to ecclesiastical architecture. And so the kinds of designs that you see there, the spaces, the lighting, the kind of stone that was used, reflected, churches in Tuscany in the 15th century. So there was a desire to create an architectural context, or an elusive context, let's say, that provided a suitable home for these works, and to recognise them as works which played a role in a religious context, not just an example of the development of perspective in the Renaissance, and in some cases, there's some altars were designed to sit beneath, Piero della Francesca's baptism, or the Pollaiuolo brothers' Saint Sebastian. So it was important to kind of recognise the role that those paintings had played in their original context. There's been a very interesting phenomenon in more recent times where works have been lent from museums, sometimes on long-term loans, to churches. So I'm thinking, for example, in Antwerp. So the Antwerp Museum has been closed for many, many years. It just reopened, I think, about 18 months ago. And works from the Antwerp Museum were lent to the cathedral, which is where some of them had actually originally come from, and put back on the altars where they'd been originally removed from. That created some very, very interesting dynamics in relation to how the museum sees its own responsibilities, and in the way that local people who went to church at the cathedral responded to the works of art that they'd previously seen only in museums. I had the wonderful experience when I worked in Spain for many years. I worked at the Prado. I did an exhibition on a 17th century artist called Murillo, And one of his most famous works is a large painting of the Immaculate Conception, which he made in the 1660s. And for a period, we were able to return that work from the museum to the chapel where it had originally been in the 17th century, and put back in its original frame, which was in the church still. And suddenly it sort of felt right. It looked right. Now, you can't do that definitively because, ownership has changed. Museums are historical constructs as well. And so eventually the work had to be returned to the museum, where it also looks very good and very interesting, has its own context with other works by the artist and contemporaries and so on. But it was a fascinating experience. And certainly in Seville, which is quite a devout city even today, to see their Inmaculada Concepción sort of returned to their chapel. We had a little bit of a struggle to get it back, actually.
Right. Because I suppose, we come to think about art, art for art's sake, and everything. Whereas a lot of these paintings, they had a very specific, they were painted with a very specific idea.
Art for art's sake is a very recent notion. No one thought, in the 17th century, nobody thought about art for art's sake. Art was always for some purpose, and religious art was for a higher purpose. The purpose of religious art, and there are, theoretical writers who would make statements about this. These paintings were intended, these architecture was intended to raise the minds of the faithful to the contemplation of God. That's what they were made for. You could say that's a form of propaganda. Well, sure enough. But that's what those works were intended to do. Are they still able to do that today? That's a very interesting question, isn't it?
In the same way, I suppose most of these paintings, or a lot of the paintings, would have come from side altars, which are often kind of abandoned in most cathedrals or churches, and not used anymore. Just out of interest, what tended to be the way that these paintings would make their way from the churches to the museums?
So if you think of medieval gilt altarpiece with those elaborate Gothic frames, what would happen is there'd be a change in taste in the church itself. And so what was the high altar? Think of the great Duccio Maestà, which was made as the high altarpiece of Siena Cathedral. Magnificent work of art. Stupendous, around 1310 or so. As time passes, taste changes, liturgical requirements also change. That work gets moved to a side altar. A new altarpiece is commissioned as the high altarpiece. It sort of slightly loses its protagonism and its interest. And later on, when the church no longer has the need for them or has fallen on hard times, that's also true. You'll find that chapters of cathedrals or parish priests will sell these pictures on to dealers or to interested buyers. These are legitimate sales in the 18th century or in the 19th century, and then these works would pass to either the local museum or indeed would be bought by dealers who would take them to France or to England or to Germany.
Right. So, English noblemen on their grand tour.
On their grand tour, exactly. Fascinated by, Sassoferrato or fascinated by Raphael, of course. Or those gold-ground pictures, which in many places have been considered old-fashioned and didn't really serve their purpose so much anymore.
No, I think it's interesting, especially in England, where to visit many churches or many historic churches, you now have to pay quite a bit, whereas to go to the museums is actually free. So, in a sense, they are available to more people in a.
It's a curious paradox, isn't it? Both you and I have worked a lot with foreign students, particularly Italian students, and they're always astonished that you come to London and you have to pay to go to St Paul's Cathedral, but you go into the National Gallery or the British Museum free of charge. It's a strange paradox of our time.
Yeah, and maybe the church is kind of missing a trick to invite people in and say something.
I certainly feel that that's the case. It's very difficult to visit Westminster Abbey. It's very difficult to visit St Paul's Cathedral unless you're prepared to shell out quite a large amount of money.
Yeah, especially for families the size of ours. So, another question, and I think this is a question that's been kind of roiling, especially in the Catholic Church at the moment, with regard to the mosaicist, Father Marco Rupnik. So I'd be interested to hear your take on the relationship of the artist to the art that he produces, especially in a kind of religious context. And I think this is something that, I mean, it's not just a question which is limited to the situation with Father Rupnik. I mean, even in London, for example, in Westminster Cathedral, we have the Stations of the Cross by Eric Gill, who turned out to have an extremely I think, frankly, sort of criminal behaviours in his own life, of abuse within his own family, and famously Caravaggio was not a semblance of Christian virtue in many moments of his life. How do you think that? I mean, how do you think that we should look at the production of artists who themselves haven't kind of lived up to the art or to the values of the art that they've produced?
Goodness, it's a kind of perennial question. That one. It's a very interesting one. I mean, there are various aspects to the question, but it seems to me that sometimes, artists have a sort of prophetic gift, and it's got nothing to do with their moral life. They have an ability to interpret the deepest human experiences. They have an ability to interpret and represent the most profound religious experiences, and in a sense, their own, the particular aspects of their own life, in a sense, have very little to do with it. They're almost channeling something which is, divine, or anyway deeply spiritual. So while we're scandalized and shocked by some of these stories, nonetheless, the images do serve their purpose, and the images can speak quite apart from the artists themselves. I mean, we know nothing about so many medieval artists. Some of them may have been, murderers and adulterers and so on, and yet their works, because of the content that they contain, because of the strength with which the imagery has been produced, somehow it sort of brings together something of the human experience of the divine.
And I mean, this is a problem that's not contained just to art. I mean, we've noticed. I mean, we've seen this a lot in literature and all sorts at the moment. Various books being, taken off the shelves or changed because of something that's been discovered about the artist themselves.
No, sure enough. I mean, if you had to, if you took out your sort of cancelling pen, to cancel the artists who misbehaved, there wouldn't be much left in the National Gallery, that's for sure.
Yeah, quite. I mean, we mentioned earlier a little bit also the development of religious art in particular. I mean, I would personally say that we're not in a good place at the moment in the Catholic Church in terms of religious art. I don't know if you'd agree with me on that, but I mean, I'd be interested to hear, the kind of story that you would tell about the development of Catholic art, and in a sense where it kind of went a bit into decline, shall we say, and what you would consider to be maybe a way in which maybe we could kind of rediscover an idiom which is both valuable in artistic terms and in the terms in which Catholic art kind of sees itself as a help to raise people to God.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that we've had continuous high-level art production ever since the 4th century. I mean, there have been some bad periods well before the 20th century. That's for sure.
Well, no, tell us a bit about what you consider like the highs and lows.
Well, I mean, there's some. I mean, it's an amazing kind of arc, the way art has been, adapted to liturgy, and I think that's a very important aspect, and I think one that should be taken much more seriously by contemporary artists. How does art relate to belief, and how does art relate to liturgy? So you have fascinating usually quite small-scale work in the catacombs and so on. Then you get the great liturgical art of the empire. You get the spectacular mosaics at Ravenna or in Sicily and in Naples and so on. Then there's a period when art is focused perhaps more on architecture rather than representation. And architecture, of course, has the ability, particularly in the Gothic period, to kind of raise the soul to the contemplation of the higher things, and you get the magnificent development of stained glass to recount the narratives of the faith and the lives of the saints. You get spectacular book decoration, fundamentally in the context of the monastery. So the monasteries become great motors of the creation of religious art. The Renaissance gives a sort of new impetus, where religious art is strongly influenced by the rediscovery of the ideal of the antique, which creates certain kind of problems in the faith as well. I mean, people forget that Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel was tremendously scandalous. We look at it with great reverence today and are astonished by the beauty and the invention and so on. But there were many people at the time who felt that this was outrageous and should be removed and should be taken down. I mean, there's a famous story of El Greco saying that he would quite happily offer his services to the Vatican if the Last Judgment was removed, and he'd paint his own instead. It would be far more suitable and far more attractive. Then there's a very kind of strong period in the 17th century where the great missionary orders are using art in a very, very inventive way. I guess in the 19th century we sense there's a sort of tiredness that creeps in to religious painting. There's a kind of difficulty to find ways which are appropriate to renew the faith, because the church is constantly looking for ways to renew the faith. Now, renewal of the faith and attachment to tradition, that's quite a difficult one to get right. And I think that's sort of where we are now. We're looking for the kind of language, the kind of idiom that works for contemporary society, that's not totally derivative or simply imitative, but at the same time is rooted in the tradition, because that's the way the church has always thought about the arts. Open to new things, of course, but rooted in tradition. So how are you going to find the synthesis that really works for our time and works in different places as well? Because the different countries have different traditions. I was recently in Japan and went to Mass in Japan, and was just very struck by the way in which the Mass, as it was celebrated there, although it was in English, had a particularly Japanese character, very different from the way we celebrate here in London, or you might celebrate in Brazil or in Argentina. So, how do you draw on the riches of the tradition of the church? And the church has a very, very, very rich tradition of image making, and find the suitable language for our time. There's been a strong sense that you return to the Byzantine tradition, that there's a perceived kind of natural spirituality,
sort of numinousness to icons.
Exactly, and for sure there's a certain language of image making in the Catholic Church which does have deep traditions, which is profoundly spiritual, that is closely bound up with the liturgy. That would make a lot of sense. On the other hand, it can't be purely imitative.
Well, in the sense that you can't just kind of start trying to produce Baroque ceilings in a modern church. Being congruous, it wouldn't make sense.
Exactly. But what is there in the Baroque tradition that can be still useful today? What is it that can still raise? I mean, in the Baroque period, people look to the art to kind of raise them up, almost physically. If you think of the Gesù in Rome, or the great ceilings by Pietro da Cortona and so on, they really kind of raise you up into the heavens. You feel sucked up into the Empyrean by all those angels and the light, and you're given an almost physical experience of the faith.
I mean, would it be right to say that the church kind of led the artistic kind of movements until a certain point? I mean, and when would you say that was the moment in which the church kind of started following rather than leading?
Well, I think the 18th century has a lot to answer for, and the century of lights, as it's called, or the Enlightenment, and I think things changed quite radically with the philosophe, the French philosophe, and of course the French Revolution. And I think the church is placed on the defensive at that point, and there is a sort of cultural retreat, and not sure we've entirely come out of it yet.
I mean, it's interesting. I spoke to a poet earlier in the kind of podcast series, and one of the things that she was speaking about was that, in a sense, poetry has also kind of closed its horizon to the things that it thinks it can even speak about. And, would you say that something similar has happened in art? Because in a sense, those ceilings, they were sort of saying, well, art can actually show us what heaven is like, in a limited way, but we can give it a go. Whereas you get the feeling that, in the sort of contemporary stuff that we see at the moment, that idea that we can see something truly transcendent has kind of retreated, and so it becomes an idiom which is actually quite difficult for the church to use if it wanted to borrow something which is not derivative.
There's a real problem, isn't there, that the mainstream has become secularized, and what is considered modern and avant-garde is essentially secular. So if in the context of the church, you want to commission art, then you've got that question of where do you borrow from? If you want to be forward-looking and avant-garde, you inevitably have to draw on the mainstream avant-garde tradition, which is a secular tradition, often hostile to the faith. So that's a challenge that you need to confront. And I think also there's a problem, isn't there, that the artists who are considered significant and the leaders of the various art movements were largely uninterested in religion, and the church rarely found the way to implicate those artists in the religious discourse, to invite them into the church, to invite them to reflect on the great traditions of the faith, and Picasso famously really didn't do any religious art at all. There's some very interesting work with Matisse or Chagall, some of these luminaries of the 20th century. But you can legitimately ask, were those just sort of one-offs, or did they create a body of work which is somehow significant in developing a contemporary artistic religious language which is still valuable? I
mean, do you see any? Do you have any kind of thoughts about where things might go, or sort of rays of hope for?
Well, what I would say, it seems to me there are certain themes that need to be taken into account with contemporary religious art. One is that it needs to be responsive to the faith context. It needs to be responsive to that. It needs to speak to the people who practice the faith, and it needs to respond to the tradition in some way. Now, put those three things together and see what comes out of that. But I think if any of those elements is missing, you have an art which is kind of separate from the tradition, separate from the faith community, and consequently of limited use, let's say.
So do you think the problem is that we don't have the artists that can do that? Or in a sense, there are these great figures, the great cardinals who kind of commissioned these wonderful works of art, and these kind of prince cardinals in the Renaissance period. Is it those kind of people who are missing? Is it the artists who are missing? Is it the money that's missing? The will? I don't know. It's all of the above?
Well, yeah, some of the above. That's that's for sure. I think there's a real kind of lack of confidence among the people who could commission great works of art because of the uncertainty about what might emerge, about the costs associated with major commissions and so on. There's a lot of nervousness about that. I think that there's not a significant pool of artists who really can say something new in the area of religious imagery. But I don't think we should lose hope. This goes through waves, and I'm sure that there will be luminaries who emerge and who provide us with a language of art that's relevant to our times, but deeply embedded in the tradition as well.
So, I'd like to speak a little bit about kind of Catholic art in England in particular. I mean, you lead one of the premier English cultural institutions, which
British, I would say, rather than English.
Sorry, yeah, British. And it is full of art, of religious art. But one thing that you notice when you go to the National Gallery is there's a big kind of hole where when it comes to English religious art, I mean there are little kind of little flashes of that you can see of what was our kind of Catholic history, our Catholic art. In especially before the Reformation, that you see in great works like the Wilton Diptych, and I mean I would say that maybe works like the stripping of the altars has changed the kind of view of the Reformation in England as essentially a moment of real cultural vandalism. So I mean, what would you say from the National Gallery's perspective is the view of British Catholic art changing? Is there much around? Is there something that we could do to make it kind of better known?
Well, from the point of view of the National Gallery, there is no English religious art except the Wilton Diptych. Right. But the Wilton Diptych is a magnificent masterpiece of painting, a magnificent masterpiece of faith as well. It's a picture which is kind of rich in the English tradition of Catholicism. It turns on the notion of the Dos Mariae, the notion that England has some special relationship with the Virgin Mary, for example. That's what the picture is about. So it says a lot about the reign of Richard II, but it also says a lot about Catholicism in England. What's the problem that we have to confront? Well, of course, there's very little of it left. There was wholesale destruction in the 1530s and 40s of religious images, of religious shrines, of wall paintings, of altarpieces. So the evidence for the Catholic tradition, the Catholic image-making tradition in Britain is quite limited. Now, there's plenty of manuscripts that have survived. There's a large amount of medieval glass that has survived. And, in the last 100 years, there's been quite a lot of work on recovering whitewashed medieval fresco cycles or murals. So we know more, certainly, than we did. But it's not, it's easy to underestimate the sheer amount of damage that was done, the destruction to images and the destruction to a certain way of thinking about how society should function as well. And it's not just in the 1530s and 40s. Of course, there's a whole second wave of destruction in the 1650s in the interregnum. So there's been, the imagery of the Catholic faith has been battered quite seriously in this country. I think it would be a very, very interesting thing to do, to try and gather up what we have. The kind of history that we've been seeing with the stripping of the altars, Eamon Duffy and other revisionist historians, as they're sometimes called, which gives us a quite different view of what medieval society in Britain was like, what life was like before the Reformation. I mean, traditionally it's been represented as corrupt, as tired, as lacking in any sort of originality and so on. That turns out not to be the case. You have a vibrant Catholic society with a lot of art in secular buildings, but in religious buildings, the faith was alive in the way society functioned with ceremonies and processions and banners and festivities and so on.
These beautiful monastic houses all over the country. I mean,
Yeah.
you see those maps of all the monastic houses that were closed, and it was just, England was kind of thick with them.
Sure. I mean, I was very struck when we did the St. Francis exhibition. I mean, the Franciscans came to Britain very, very early and established many houses across the country, and their presence was a vibrant sort of Catholic presence, until the Reformation. So I think it would be very interesting to try and sort of gather some of the surviving material together and look particularly at the painting tradition in this country, with, of course, the Wilton diptych representing a culmination or a culminatory moment, let's say. But it's wrong to say that the story of art in this country begins with Holbein and his portraits. That's simply not true. So we need to tell a richer story with the fragments, with the pieces, with the bits and pieces that we have that have survived. I mean, think of the great Westminster Retable, for example, in Westminster Abbey, and the Wilton diptych. There you've got two poles that show just how impressive the art that was produced in this country was.
And I think any attempt at a particularly kind of British Catholic artistic idiom would have to, in some way, kind of reconnect with that. So I think an exhibition like that, I think, would be super important for the future as well. So
well, let's see if that's something that we can focus on a bit more for the future.
Yeah. So just talking about the future, I know that you have a big anniversary coming up for the gallery. There's lots of work going on. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? And maybe also, if you could give us a preview of any stuff that's coming up that would be particularly of interest to Catholic listeners.
Yes. Well, thank you for mentioning that, Piero. It gives me the opportunity to do a little plug for the National Gallery Bicentenary, which is a centenary that we want everyone to celebrate. So the National Gallery is there for everyone. We're open 361 days a year. We're free to everyone. And, of course, we want to share our pictures with the whole country. So we're going to kick off the bicentenary celebrations on the 10th of May with 12 major masterpieces going to 12 locations across the whole of the UK, beginning with Belfast, where we're going to lend Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, going on to Edinburgh, where we're lending a Vermeer. Liverpool will have the great Velasquez Rope Venus. And in each of those locations, the museums will be able to celebrate our bicentenary in the way that they want. So either with a small dossier exhibition or with a bigger show where our picture might well be the star of the season, let's say. Then we've got we're getting a truck that's going to go around the country and bring the National Gallery to towns and villages. It will be stopping in town squares and village greens, and artistic activity will take place there in what we're calling the art trip or the art road trip. But then we've got some big shows coming up in London. We've got Van Gogh, a big exhibition happening in the autumn. Funnily enough, there's never been a Van Gogh show at the National Gallery, would you believe? But it's 1 century. It's 100 years since we acquired the sunflowers. It's 100 years since we acquired the Van Gogh's chair and so on. So it's certainly an appropriate way of celebrating the bicentenary. And then in 2025, at the very end of the bicentenary year, we've got an exhibition devoted to Siena around 1300. Well, Siena saw a flourishing of the arts, with Duccio, the Lorenzetti brothers, with Simone Martini, but also a real flourishing of the making of liturgical objects and reliquaries and sculpture and glass and manuscript painting and so on. So all of this will be gathered together at the National Gallery. So a show we're doing together with the Met in New York. They'll do it first, and it will come to us in 2025. And for those who love religious art, for sort of listeners of this program, the viewers of this program, I'm sure that Siena 1300 will be an exhibition that will please people a lot. We're also doing major works in the gallery itself, and so we'll be reopening the Caesary Wing in 2025, and there'll be some nice acquisitions too, 1 or 2 surprises coming up.
Wonderful. So, well, thank you very much for speaking with us. It's been wonderful to speak to you in front of a microphone as opposed to in front of the dinner table as we normally do. But no, thank you very much for that. And I hope that we can get you back at some point, maybe to talk about some of these exciting new purchases.
Very, very pleased to do that. And it's been great fun to talk to you, Piero. Normally we're chatting over a plate of pasta at Mum and Papa's house. Yeah. But thank you for having me.